Almost every old barn in America is red. Not blue, not green, red. Drive through any farm state and you'll see the same color again and again on barns built 100 years apart in regions that never talk to each other. And the reason isn't paint or tradition or even a choice. It's chemistry, thrift, and on more farms than you'd expect, a little bit of blood. In the next few minutes, you'll find out why farmers had almost no choice but red before there was a paint store to walk into. You'll hear what they actually mixed into that coating, something we'd never use today. And you'll see why. Even after cheap manufactured paint gave farmers every color imaginable, they kept choosing red anyway. This is a documented story, sitting in agricultural records and historic preservation research. It starts with a problem every farmer faced the moment a barn's wood was cut and raised. Picture a farm in the early 1800s. There's no hardware store down the road, no truck delivering cans of paint. If you wanted to protect the wood on a new barn, you had to make the coating yourself from whatever was sitting on your own land, and bare wood left untreated was a real threat, not a cosmetic one. Here's the strange part. Almost nobody expects. The danger wasn't just rain or sun cracking the boards. It was a green, creeping fungus that spread across untreated wood, especially in damp climates, and ate a barn from the outside in. A barn wasn't a garage. It held the grain, the tools, and the animals that kept a family alive through winter. Losing it to rot within a decade wasn't an inconvenience. For a lot of families, it was closer to a death sentence. Sit with that for a second. The barn that failed wasn't just a building. It was that year's harvest, that winter's feed, and every tool the family owned, all under one unprotected roof. So farmers needed a sealant, something to coat the wood before the weather and the fungus could get to it. And the cheapest, most available sealant on earth was already growing in their own fields. Some tried other coverings first. Plain tar, whitewash made from crushed limestone, even just letting the wood weather naturally and hoping for the best. None of those held up the way a real sealant needed to. Tar cracked in the cold, whitewash washed off in a hard rain. Bare wood just kept rotting on schedule. For a family that had just spent a season's savings raising that barn, watching it fail in 10 years wasn't an option they could afford to accept. And here's the part of the fix that almost nobody guesses correctly on the first try. Here's the part most people never hear about, how the actual mixture came together. The base of the coating was linseed oil, pressed straight from flaxseed, something almost every farm grew or could trade for. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and once it dried, it sealed the wood hard against moisture. But on its own, linseed oil left the wood a dull, flat tan, and it did nothing to stop the fungus that was actually rotting the barn. Farmers needed something to mix in. Something that killed mold and moss on contact. What no one expected was that the fix was already rusting in their own barnyard. Iron oxide, plain rust, turned out to be genuinely toxic to fungus and moss. And every farm had scrap iron lying around, old tools, broken hardware, worn-out parts, slowly rusting in the weather. Farmers scraped that rust off, ground it down, and stirred it into the linseed oil. Here's a detail worth pausing on. This wasn't a one-time fix. Farmers reground and remixed the coating every time they repainted, using whatever fresh rust was on hand that year. The detail almost no one mentions is how crude that grinding process actually was. There was no factory equipment involved, just a farmer, a hammer, or a millstone, and whatever rusted metal happened to be lying around that week. The mixture sealed the wood and killed the fungus that would have rotted it, and as a side effect, it turned the whole batch a deep burnt red. Nobody sat down and chose red as a color. Red was just what rusted iron looked like once you mixed it into oil. The color was an accident of chemistry, not a decision. Here's where the story usually stops in most retellings, but it doesn't stop there. But that's not even the strangest ingredient some farmers added next. On a number of farms, agricultural historians note that extra ingredient was animal blood left over from butchering and completely free. Mixed straight into the paint, the iron already present in the blood added to the same rust-red tone and reportedly helped the coating cure harder as it dried. It sounds strange to modern ears, but to a farmer working with what was already on hand, it was simple math. Nothing on a farm went to waste, and blood cost nothing. This is part of why so many of the oldest surviving barns share almost the exact same shade of dark brownish red. They were made from the same short list of cheap local ingredients. Records from agricultural extension services describe this recipe as regionally common rather than universal. It varied farm to farm based on whatever was on hand that season. But the pattern shows up again and again across old farm journals and preservation research: oil, rust, and sometimes blood. Now here's the question that actually matters. If that color was just an accident, rust and on some farms blood, why is it still the color we associate with a barn today, when paint now comes in every shade imaginable? By the later 1800s, factory-made paint started reaching rural areas, and for the first time, farmers could choose any color at all. You'd expect barns to scatter across every shade on the shelf. The stranger fact is that most of them didn't. Manufactured red paint was still the cheapest color to produce because the same iron oxide pigments were abundant and inexpensive to refine at industrial scale. So for another generation, red stayed the practical, budget-conscious choice, even with a full color wheel available. Notice what's happening here. The chemistry that forced red in 1820 wasn't even the reason anymore by 1880. The habit had outlived its own cause. Here's the part that most people still get wrong today. They assume the story ends with the price tag. It doesn't. And then something else happened that had nothing to do with cost. A red barn had become the visual shorthand for a working farm itself. Stop and picture it for a second. A blue barn, a purple barn, a barn painted bright yellow. It would look wrong to almost anyone, even though nothing about the wood or the weather demands red anymore. Paint companies noticed it, farmers noticed it, and a color that started as rust and blood turned into the single most recognizable symbol of American agriculture. Drive past a red barn today, and it's not because anyone still needs iron oxide to fight off fungus. It's because some traditions quietly outlive the reason they started. Here's the part worth knowing. If you ever restore or repaint an old barn yourself, that traditional red isn't just nostalgia dressed up as a color choice. Iron oxide pigment is still, by most modern measures, one of the most UV-stable, longest-lasting colors you can put on exterior wood. The old farmers weren't just being frugal with what they had on hand. They accidentally landed on one of the most durable exterior coatings ever made, decades before anyone understood the chemistry behind why it worked so well. Modern preservation researchers studying historic barns have pointed to that same iron oxide base as one reason so many 19th century barns are still standing at all. Sometimes the old way survived this long because it simply worked better than almost everything that came after it. Think about how rare that actually is. A fix a farmer improvised out of scrap rust and leftover oil outlasted almost every synthetic alternative invented after it. So the next time you pass a red barn, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. 200 years of chemistry, thrift, and hard-won trial and error, the color of rusted iron, drying in the sun. That's the real story, documented and still standing in fields across the country. If you want more of these, the real history behind the things we drive past without ever asking why, subscribe to The Quiet Farmer. And tell us in the comments, is there a red barn where you grew up?